Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, depending on your time zone. I am by name Ngu Augustine Anicho, the moderator of today's meeting. I thank the OAF body for this opportunity to serve Mother Africa. I thank the OAF chairman, Mr. Ezenwozo, for instituting such a great movement and organization and giving me this platform. My thanks to the entire leadership of OAF, the African Union, the other pro-African movements and organizations and their respective leaders. To the presidents of the 54 African countries, I say, may you all be blessed and given extra wisdom to lead. To all African people, both at home and in diaspora, I say, may we continue to soar higher, no matter the condition and situations that surround us. It is only but a little time. Let me remind us that today is a great day for Africans worldwide, as recorded and approved by the United Nations. Today is the UN Day for Abolition of Slave Trade. The OAF leadership decided to use this opportunity to talk on this important topic. Today we bring to you, out of our 7-point agenda, a very controversial topic which have been a very hard nut to crack from time immemorial. Today we are going to call up many powerful pro-African activists to speak on the topic, which says the reparations for transatlantic slave trade. The reparation for transatlantic slave trade. Without taking much of our time, let's make welcome the chairman of OAF to give us his speech before we start calling on other dignitaries and pro-Africans to do same. Hello?
Hello? Yes. Thank you so much. Greetings to all Africans worldwide. Jambo. No. I honor all our ancestors because of whom we are. I honor all African heads of states, all African heads of organizations, all non-African persons and organizations working 24/7 for the good of the continent and people of Africa. I say, well done to you all. I salute all OAF top leaders and all OAF members. The leaders and people of Africa can trust you because you have the willingness, the character, and capacity to transform Africa into a glory. I come in the name of the Most High God, who has called us into this hallowed task of leading Africa into a destiny. And once again, I say, well done to you all. On this day, the 2nd of December, 2021, let's talk about the transatlantic slave trade and the reparations for it. On this day of the UN International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. It all began in the year 1441, when two Portuguese captains by the name Nuno Tristo and Gonçalves took 12 Africans from Cabo Branco in Mauritania and sold them as slaves in Lisbon, Portugal. In the year 1444, another Portuguese by the name Lanzarote de Freitas came into the Bay of Alguin in Mauritania again, took 235 Africans into slavery and sold them in his hometown of Lagos in Portugal. From thence, the Portuguese began to set up slave forts across the coast of West Africa. For example, the Elmina Castle in modern-day Ghana. They continued to raid Africa and set up slave plantations across the west coast of Africa and some of them in Portugal. So continued the slave trade until the Portuguese eventually set up their trading port in Seville, Spain, and began to recruit the Spanish into this trade. Eventually, the Spanish the Spanish traders would join in this transatlantic slave trade. It all continued at that scale until the year 1492. In the year 1492, something great happened. On the 12th of October 1492, Christopher Columbus became the first European confirmed to step his foot on the Americas. And that European landing on the Americas became the nightmare were into slavery or in one way or the other. The transatlantic slave trade continued after the year 1492 with strong fire that the entire Africa was affected very drastically. In the year 1501, Spanish traders brought in the first wave of Africans into the Americas. From the year 1545, the Portuguese brought in their own wave of Africans enslaved into the Americas. From the year 1526 or 1562, John Hawkins became the first European, the first English trader to trade on Africans and sell them as slaves in the Americas. He later became the father of the triangular slave trade. So continued the slave trade. Now, the slave trade continued to raid Africans and to bring in more Africans from Africa into Europe. Now let's talk about the effects of this slave trade. Let's talk about the triangular effects of this slave trade, because we have to bear in mind that three main groups or three main regions were involved in this trade, namely Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Let's talk about the effects of the slave trade on Europe. Europe became so rich courtesy of the slave trade. Many European families became wealthy through the slave trade. Many European businesses were set up through the slave trade or proceeds from the slave trade. For example, Barclay Brothers funded the Barclay banks using proceeds from the transatlantic slave trade. The city of Manchester in the UK bases its affluence on cotton, which were imported from slave plantations. Also, the city of Birmingham in the UK profited from selling guns in exchange for slaves. The cities of Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow in the UK all profited heavily from the transatlantic slave trade. Also, the transatlantic slave trade funded the Industrial Revolution, which wiped out poverty from Europe. It was the proceeds from cotton that funded the Industrial Revolution. In fact, according to BBC, it was in cotton that the Industrial Revolution began. And that big revolution began in and around Manchester. At the time, cotton became the major export of Britain. And it was in that cotton that Britain began to experience the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was funded by proceeds from the transatlantic slave trade. Also, the invention of the steam engine by James Watt was funded using proceeds from the transatlantic slave trade. European nations became so wealthy through the slave trade. Therefore, the effect of the slave trade on Europe was enriching. Now let's talk about the effect of the slave trade on the Americas. It was the slave trade that built the Americas, Central, North, and South. Without the slave trade, America, as it's known now, would have been as wealthy as it is. It was the commercial agriculture that Africans who were enslaved in Americas that formed the basis for the wealth of the Americas. Without the commercial agriculture, which the enslaved Africans carried out in the Americas, there would have been anything as such as the wealth that we have today in the Americas. Let's talk about the effect of slave trade in Africa. The African continent suffered drastically, suffered heavily because of the slave trade. Let's talk about the population effect of the slave trade on Africa. The population of Africa suffered heavily because of the slave trade. For example, in the year 1600, the population of Africa was about 117 million people. But in the year 1700, the population of Africa fell to about 106 million. And in the year 1800, the population of Africa increased only by 1 million to about 107 million. But following the abolition of slave trade and slavery in the 19th century, the population of Africa rose from about 111 million by the year 1850 to about 767 million by the year 1999, and over 1.3 billion as I speak. This shows that the transatlantic slave trade affected the population of Africa by over 2 billion persons. Let's talk about the effect of the slave trade on conflict in Africa. The slave trade contributed to a lot of conflicts in Africa, as kingdoms were fighting kingdoms to produce slaves rather than to build an economy. It tore the African society apart. Everybody was afraid, and everybody was living in fear and tension of being captured. Let's also talk about the effect of the transatlantic slave trade on racism. Unlike the Arab slave trade or the Roman slave trade, which were not continent or people exclusive, the transatlantic slave trade was the only slave trade that focused on only one continent and people, the people of Africa and the continent of Africa. Only few Irish persons were enslaved, but the majority of the slaves were from Africa. This gave rise to the notion that the people of Africa So the transatlantic slave trade gave rise to racism. Also, the transatlantic slave trade led to many losses on the side of the African continent and people. The African continent and people lost entirely the industrial era. All the invention we could have invented, we couldn't because of the transatlantic slave trade. The continent and people of Africa suffered psychologically, emotionally, economically, and this transatlantic slave trade led to even a more milking of the continent of Africa in the name of colonization, because the transatlantic slave trade opened the doors to the colonization of Africa, where Africa lost trillions upon trillions of dollars of wealth, and the people of Africa were enslaved right in Africa. There are many devastating effects of the slave trade, including poverty in Africa. That there are over 500 million people living in poverty in Africa today. The transatlantic slave trade still has its effect on that poverty in Africa. We lost over 4 centuries. We lost able-bodied men who could have built the African economy. And today people are asking why Africa is poor. Which continent would suffer what Africa suffered for 400 years and be rich? The transatlantic slave trade devastated the African continent. And unfortunately, instead of the world paying Africa the due for this devastation of the African continent, the Europeans instead went ahead to colonize Africa. Until today, the African continent is suffering from neocolonialism. The African continent has been bled for 4 centuries and bled again for about a century and still bleeding. When shall the enslavement of the people of Africa end? When shall the racism that the people of Africa suffer end? That is why we are talking about reparations. But unfortunately, again, instead of the Europeans to talk about indemnification for the people of Africa for what we suffered courtesy of the slave trade, they have put up arguments against this reparation. Some of the arguments that the Europeans have put up against reparations for Africa is that number one, that it was Africans who were going into inner Africa to bring out fellow Africans to sell to the Europeans as slaves. This statement is a deceptive statement. Like I mentioned earlier, two Portuguese captains, Nuno Tristão and Anto Gonçalves, were the first to start the transatlantic slave trade. Before then, Africans were not going into the bush or going into the cities of Africa to bring out fellow Africans to sell to the Europeans as slaves. Therefore, that statement is ultra-virus. Also, African kings and people resisted the slave trade. For example, King Afonso of then Congo resisted the slave trade. In fact, he wrote protest letters to King João of Portugal, asking him to stop the depopulation of his kingdom through the Portuguese slave trade, all to no avail. Also, King Gesha II, the successor of King Afonso, made similar unsuccessful protests, trying to stop the slave trade, all to no avail. Queen Nzinga Mbandi of then Angola, though not by the name Angola, but the kingdom in present-day Angola, fought tooth and nail to stop the Portuguese slave trade. She fought, but they resisted and they overpowered her. Many African kings, queens, people resisted the slave trade. Africans were not happy selling their fellow Africans as slaves. Even King Agaja Trudeau, king of Dahomey, fought against slave trade and even raided the camps and the forts of the slave traders, of the Europeans, all to no avail. When the African people and the African kings and people saw that they could not resist the power of the Europeans, they had to succumb and begin to sell their fellow Africans as slaves. Therefore, Africans engaged in slave trade under an atmosphere of force, of coercion, of subjugation, and deception. Therefore, the argument that Africans sold their fellow Africans as slaves is an incompetent argument. It doesn't have any power. It doesn't have any value anywhere. Also, some have put up the argument that Africans should not be paid any reparations because they say that Africans benefited from slave trade. My question is, what did Africans benefit from the slave trade? What did the Africans benefit from slave trade? Did you know that there are instances of Europeans exchanging a single plate for 10 Africans? Is that trade? There are instances of Europeans exchanging 40 male Africans for a single umbrella. Is that trade? There are instances of Europeans exchanging a cannon gun for 100 able Africans, and they call it slave, and they call it trade. No wonder it is called slave trade, because this is there is something beneficial about the transatlantic slave trade on the side. That is the fact. Thirdly, there is another argument that Europeans have put forth against reparation. They say that the current Europeans are not the ones who enslaved Africans, and that we, the current Africans on earth, that we are not the ones that were enslaved. Therefore, they do not owe us any reparation. Let's look into that argument. Because a US Senator, Senator Mitch McConnell, made such statements when he was asked about reparation. Now let's address what the Honorable Senator said, that we are not the people who they owe reparation, and they are not the ones who carried out the slave trade. Or current Americans, whites in America, they are not the ones who conquered America. After this, Christopher Columbus landed in America or the Americas in 1492. But these same Europeans are the ones controlling the Americas. Why did they accept to control the Americas, whereas they are not the ones who conquered the Americas? It was their fathers, and the same fathers were the ones who carried out the slave trade. Secondly, the influence that the olden Europeans had over the continent of Africa during the time of the slave trade, the current Europeans still enjoy it through what they call new colonialism, where they still hold the people of Africa in thralls. Why did they have to inherit that influence and not the debt for the slave trade? Is there any debt that the continent of people of Africa are owing the past generation that we're not obligated to pay? There is none. Whatever a father transfers to the son owns. And just as the European ancestors transferred the wealth of the world, if I may say so, to the current Europeans, that is the same way the debt that the fathers incurred, they are obligated to pay. And we, the current Africans, who are the descendants of Africans who were enslaved, are suffering the consequences. Also, there is an argument by the Europeans that there is no call again for reparations. Why? They say that they have already paid reparations. How? They say that the Obama presidency was a reparation, that the passage of the civil rights law was a reparation. We are all reparations. Let's look into the arguments. First of all, the Obama presidency was a triumph of popularity and not a reparation. Obama was the most popular candidate and he won. When Jesse Jackson contested for presidency in the US, he did not win. So why didn't they give it to him? Since they're talking about reparation. Also, the passage of the civil rights law was not a reparation. Every single human being on earth has the right to liberty, has the right to vote, has the right to do what every other human being can do, except he committed a crime. That is the only reason why he should be denied his civil rights. And the people of Africa did not commit any crime by being African. And they didn't commit any crime coming to the US. They were brought in slave ships to be in Europe. Therefore, the passage of civil rights is not, or was not a reparation, was rather a passage of natural law to those who deserve it as human beings. Also, those who say that the abolition of slavery was also the right, as it was a reparation, should also know that every human being was born to be free. Therefore, that's not a reparation. Reparation, as we know it, has to be a restitution of materials that the people who have been repaired or paid back lost. Giving me back my natural right is not reparation. You give me back what I lost when you took the natural right from me. So these are some of the arguments that they have put forth against reparation. Also, there's also the argument that slavery existed in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. Therefore, there's no call for reparation. That is not a statement. Because slavery existed in every society before the transatlantic slave trade. There was slavery in Europe, carried out by the Vikings, carried out by the Romans. There was slavery in Asia, carried out by the Mongolians. When Genghis Khan began to conquer East Asia, conquer Asia, conquer the parts of the world, he carried out slave trade. Almost every kingdom carried out slavery. There was slavery in every part of the world, including the Americas and also in Africa. In Africa, we had the military slavery, we had peonage system, peonage slavery, where you owe someone a debt and the person has control over you for a period of time, called peonage. There was slavery for sacrifice, where there were slaves who were to be offered for sacrifice, and all this slavery. But there was nothing like chattel slavery in Africa, and there was no instance of Africans selling fellow Africans to Europeans before the transatlantic slave trade. Therefore, that argument doesn't hold any water. Now, why the Europeans are busy putting up arguments against the reparations for slavery, for the slave trade? Reparations have been paid to other people in the world who were injured. For example, if you go into the Bible, in the book of Genesis and Exodus, talking about how the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites, according to the Bible, when the Israelites were living in the book of Exodus, the Egyptians paid the reparations to the Israelites. Yes, because it is written in the book of Exodus that the Egyptians gave whatever the Israelites asked for, and the Israelites kept asking the Egyptians for material things. They didn't ask them to just release them and go. No, they had to pay reparations for the 400 years, about 430 years that they were in Egypt, of which some parts of those years were accounted as slave period, and they were not paid. So that was God instituting a reparation without going through litigation or so on, just by favor. That was their reparation. Also, after the First and Second World Wars, in which the Axis lost the war to the Allies, the Axis were forced to pay reparations to the Allies. For example, after the Germans lost the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles forced the French to pay a reparation of about 102 billion marks, gold marks, to France, which in modern day money for about it took the Germans about 92 years to pay off that debt. Now check it. The First World War lasted for just about 4 years, from 1914 to 1918. The Germans had to pay through their nose about $270 billion. Now check the slave trade that began in 1441 and lasted up to about 1900. Even after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, abolition of slavery in 1865, the slave trade was still going on in its flickers. So what do you say about that? Also, the Japanese Americans who suffered internment during the Second World War have been paid their reparations. The US has paid about $1.6 billion reparations to the Japanese Americans who were interned during the Second World War, after the Pearl Harbor incidents, when Japanese bombers dropped bombs on the Pearl Harbor. Also, reparations have been paid, or some reparations have been paid, to the Jews who suffered during the Holocaust in Germany during the time of Hitler. At least $100 billion have been paid as reparations to the Jewish people. These are examples, they are there to be confirmed. Even unjust reparations have been paid. For example, Haiti had to take out about 122 years to pay off the debt of reparation that France put on her neck. What about $21 billion as reparations for France colonizing Haiti? Some African countries have also been mandated by France to pay what they call colonial taxes. These are unjust reparations. If unjust reparations and just reparations have been paid to people of the world, then why should it be an issue for reparations to be paid to people of Africa who are so deserving of it? Reparations have to be paid to the people of Africa. Some Africans have been pressing for this reparation. For example, a US Congressman, John Conyers, kept presenting the bill for reparations on the floor of the US Congress from the year 1989 and kept pushing for this reparation for over 15 years, all to no avail. Also, in the year 1992, a group of respectable Africans under the name Eminent Persons came together to talk about reparations for the content of people of Africa. Such eminent persons included the former president-elect of Nigeria, Chief MKO Abiola, Kenyan scholar Ale Mazrui, and Miriam Makeba of South Africa. These persons came together to talk about reparations for Africans, but till now, nothing has happened. Now, we talk about the price for the reparation. Some have put in, say it should be about $777 trillion reparation. Some have said it should be about $12 trillion reparations. But whatever, reparations have to be paid to the people of Africa for the wrongs that the world did to us, for the good that we have done to the world. Reparations have to be paid, number one, because it is just. Here, we're talking about justice. Justice is to give to everyone what is due to him or to her. The right to life, right to fair hearing, right to vote or be voted for, these are all natural rights. The right to the restitution of stolen property or stolen mandate is also a right. Reparation is also a right. We're talking about justice. Secondly, reparation has to be paid to the people of Africa because that is the only way to appease the people of Africa who died in this evil slave. They have to be remembered. They have to be honored for the evil that they suffered, to appease their souls, to make them feel good that the evil that they suffered during that trade, that they should forgive the world and should forgive us all.
We are very sorry. The network is really bad. But we hope that this network would allow us to do all we have to do today. Our leader has been cut short. The network has not been in his favor. Don't know, brother. Our leader will soon join us, but before then, I think we have to take a speech from another person. Mr. Titus Zulu, are you present? Mr. Titus Zulu. Mr. Titus Zulu, he's about to join us. He will be with us soon.
Hello.
The network is a big challenge, but whatever may be, today's broadcast will continue. Our leader is back. Our leader is back. He's back to continue from where he stopped. Please continue, sir.
Bring me up.
Okay, okay. Yeah, you are in.
Not yet in. Still back.
Haven't been able to connect back. Please, can you please start from where you stopped, able leader? Oh my God. There. Sorry about the network issues. Asanaba Kwaku. Are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, okay, okay. Then maybe you continue from where you stopped.
Exactly. Exactly. So,
yeah.
So especially we have to pay these reparations to the people of Africa because the people of Africa are not happy, especially the youth. Many youths are not happy reading about the history of this slave trade. I myself am not happy because the youth know that part of the reasons why they're suffering the poverty we're suffering in the world today in Africa is because of the slave trade. And nothing has been done about that. Because of that, African youths are looking for other avenues to get their reparation. And those avenues are not that right. Fourthly, pay reparations to the continent and people of Africa to break the cycle of poverty in Africa, to end this poverty ravaging the African continent. If the people of Africa should have what they did, get this. This is one of the reasons why and this reparation we're talking about paying a reparation for each of the people of Africa so far in slavery. About 400 years of slavery.
Abolition of slavery.
The people of Africa 100 years. $200 trillion. That is what the Europeans must pay to the people of Africa for the slave trade. And also, the reparations could come not only in monetary form, it could also come in cash and in kind to the people of Africa in the diaspora, which are also the descendants of enslaved Africans, and to the continental people of Africa who are still in Africa. It should come to Africans in cash and in kind, as I said earlier. For example, it could come in scholarships. It could come in funding projects in Africa. Example, the Grand Enga Dam, which is going to cost about 75 billion US dollars to complete. It could also come in giving free visa to all Africans to travel to any country of their choice in the world. Renaming cities, streets, monuments after Africans, enslaved Africans especially. Giving a holiday global holiday to celebrate, to remember or commemorate the transatlantic slave trade. I commend the United Nations for remembering this day of abolition of slavery, and to also remind the world that slavery is still ongoing in the present world. And it's also the United Nations Day for the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and other days. So I commend the United Nations. So the reparations could take over 100 years to pay to the people of Africa. So we ask the world to look into this matter and pay it. We call on African, European, American leaders and organizations. We call on the United Nations, the African Union, the European Union, the US Congress, the Canadian Parliament, all these institutions to, as a matter of urgency, begin to look into the issue of reparations for the people of Africa, because it is just and it is due. And we call on all organizations, African and non-African organizations, to come together to support OF and support other organizations who are pressing for this reparation. And before I end my talk, I want to honor the Quakers. The Quakers are it's a group of a religious group that fought tooth and nail to end the slavery and slave trade. I also commend William Wilberforce, Abraham Lincoln, and other abolitionists for all their efforts in bringing the transatlantic slave trade and slavery to an end. And also believe that many white persons and organizations in the world today are going to support the African call, or even the humanist call and divine call for reparations for the people of Africa, knowing fully well that though we may be black or white, we are all humans, and justice is good for every human. Thank you very much. I commend you for listening. Thank you for all the support, and I say let's listen to what the next speaker will have to say about this. Thank you very much. I salute you all.
Thank you, our able leader. Thank you very much for this wonderful. Thank you, our able leader, for this wonderful speech which you have given us. You have thrown more light to the challenges of reparation in Africa for transatlantic slave trade. The next person on our list today is no other person than our father, our brother, Mr. Titus Zulu. Mr. Titus Zulu will be speaking on the topic, if there should be reparations for slave trade, should there be a reparation of slave trade for transatlantic slavery? The network is too bad. Them joining us have been a challenge, but God's willing, everybody will still join. Mr. Kweku, you are welcome. Mr. Kweku, can you hear me? Can you hear me? You can't hear me? Wow. The network is terribly bad today. Mr. Kweku, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mr. Kweku?
Very much.
Okay.
We thank our chairman very much
Okay, well,
for the love that he has for Africa, because it requires a lot of time for someone to have and organize such an important thing for Mama Africa. And I hope that everything that we want come to reality. But for the matter of reparation, do all of us, the youth of Africa, are ready to do that? The youth of Africa, are we ready to do that? We can demand
the network, too bad. Too bad.
will we get
many of the nations.
As in, I can see Annie.
People just now we don't run online. Hey, Jesus Christ! How many calls have made my messages? Missed calls, 4 missed calls on WhatsApp.
Hello? Sorry about the network failure. This meeting will be automatically adjourned until a day we will have a clear skies to continue. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, great Africans. Till when next we meet.